Over the last 15 years, I've had the privilege of interviewing and producing videos with well over 200 academics on their area of expertise, chiefly philosophers, scientists and theologians, many of which are professors at prestigious universities. I suppose the initial aim, if it doesn't sound too grand, was to produce an illustrated video encyclopedia of faith and thought, of philosophy and theology. But rather than producing more videos with more academics, which I'm sure I'm continuing to do, it's been suggested that I compile a chronological overview or guide to what has already been accomplished. But before we start that intellectual journey, there's, I'm afraid, an advert to endure. For me, this has been and continues to be a labour of love. In other words, I don't get paid, but there's always expenses to cover. So one way you can help develop this project is to subscribe to the website where the complete project is hosted. Even though a portion of all the videos produced appear on YouTube, what you gain from a small subscription is access to a full and complete version of all the material. It's also worth saying that all the subscriptions go towards developing the project. The story so far. We could begin in antiquity or at the beginning of the 1st century and tell the story from there. And there's plenty in this project you can look at to inform you about that. But we're going to start with what's more familiar to us all, our modern world and those who made it. And also something I've written about myself. Now, this is not going to be a dispassionate or detached account, if such a thing is even possible, but I'm going to be developing a point. When studying the development of the modern world, you might expect a familiar narrative, one that I've heard repeatedly told, the common story of the journey from faith to doubt. But we're going to explore what in many respects might be seen as the opposite of that story. Let's call it the road from philosophy to faith. Let me explain. When compiling the video material on modern philosophers, let's say Descartes, Kant, Hegel, etc., I contacted those who'd written authoritative works, the recognised experts as it were, and often had no idea about whether they had any religious commitment or belief to speak of, only to find out that during the interview that not only had they written about the philosopher they were expert in, they'd also written works about their own religious faith, or told me personally about that faith. Something I was not expecting from an expert on Hegel or Wittgenstein. Not only was I witnessing this move towards faith in those who contributed videos to the project, but also in the material surveyed. See, I also want to register the fact that many of the central issues that modern philosophy and modern philosophers wrestle with did not fit well and in fact at times opposed the growth and popularity of scientific materialism. Questions in the work of Descartes and Kant about our consciousness and our thinking and reasoning selves and the sense of freedom of choice we experience did not fit well with mindless materialism. Questions about what could be the basis of our moral convictions, probably any modern philosopher you care to mention, seem to clash with those who worship science and do not take the humanities seriously. Questions about what gives our lives meaning and value, from philosophers in German Romanticism, from Schopenhauer, Nietzsche and beyond to existentialism, made little sense in the context of such reductive physicalism. And questions raised by the scientific revolution about the origins and nature of the cosmos, why there was something rather than nothing. None of these questions have gone away. Why? Because according to these philosophers, such fundamental questions are not easily encompassed or satisfactorily addressed unless you're willing to go beyond what can be examined in a test tube. So I thought it might be nice to hear this contrasting story for a change. that the modern narrative of the journey from faith to doubt is not a full or fair account of what you find, and that a better story could be told, something like the road from philosophy to faith. So where to begin? There are many suggestions with regard to the origins of modern thought. For example, the modern world we live in would be unrecognisable without the Reformation, or the scientific revolution, or the great voyages of discovery. But the thinker most frequently advocated as the father of modern philosophy would of course be the 17th century René Descartes. When looking for an academic to do a video introduction on Descartes' philosophy, the person I most frequently came across was the philosopher John Cottingham, who I spent a fascinating afternoon interviewing. In his introduction, he highlights for me two contrasting aspects of Descartes' thought. That Descartes was as much a scientist, being interested in what became known at the time as natural philosophers, as he was a speculative philosopher, for he was a key figure in the development of mechanistic and atomistic science. But he also points out the fact that he saw his philosophy as a way of supporting and defending his religious faith.
Well, Descartes was born in 1596 and he lived in a period of great philosophical excitement, a period of change. When he was growing up, Galileo turned his telescope on Venus and Jupiter and started to gather the evidence that would really sink the old Earth-centered view of the cosmos. Descartes was very interested in science. He was in some ways what we'd now call a scientist, and a lot of his early work was on physics and on mechanics, and he was a great mathematician. In fact, he's in some ways best known for his work on mathematics. But he was also very interested in metaphysics and indeed in God. He was brought up by the Jesuits. He was a devout Catholic and remained so all his life. And he was interested in metaphysics partly because he wanted foundations for science. He wanted a reliable basis on which physics and the other sciences could be built.
The irony here is that the materialistic science that Descartes was keen to develop was to become one of the greatest challenges to religious belief in modernity. In fact, to the very religious orthodoxy he was keen to defend. And he was very clear concerning the support he wanted to offer that orthodoxy.
I dare boast that faith has never been so strongly supported by human reason as it may be if one follows my principles.
Descartes thus presented himself as a champion of theological orthodoxy, and he would no doubt have been accepted as such by most of his contemporaries. Far from conceiving himself as inaugurating atheism, Descartes presents himself as its arch-enemy, upon which he will inflict a terminal defeat.
But to develop this new science of mechanistic materialism, he had to reject the very philosophy that had been integral to Catholic theology and he'd been tutored in as a student, that being medieval scholasticism.
Descartes occupies a pivotal role in the transition from the widely accepted scholastic view of science to its complete rejection and the emergence of what we think of as modern scientific methodology.
But for Descartes, there was one thing he could not account for in terms of his new science of mechanistic materialism. And interestingly, what he found as resistant to this new interpretation of the natural world became the ultimate foundation for his philosophy and what he's best known for today. But to understand this fully, we need to follow the path he took in greater detail. For the path he took is crucial in understanding what we're going to survey, so we will spend some time telling this story. See, the natural philosophy he'd been introduced to as a student and an approach that had largely dominated the Middle Ages, was based on the physics the classical philosopher Aristotle had taught. For this Aristotelian perspective, the substance or matter the world is made of gains its character, nature, form from what might be described as soul or even mind, and informs and animates each part of it.
For the schoolmen who taught this Aristotelian philosophy, bodies were made up of prime matter and substantial form. Matter is what everybody shares, while form is what differentiates bodies from one another. And so it is form that explains why stones fall and fire rises, why horses neigh and humans reason.
When looking back on his Aristotelian education, Descartes understood the form of that matter, what gave substance its character in terms of its nature, being like little minds. Minds that animated its nature and shaped its character.
As Daniel Garber explains further, there are of course numerous different ways of understanding what these forms were to the schoolmen. Descartes was fond of thinking of them as little minds attached to bodies, causing the behaviour characteristic of different sorts of substances. As Descartes says, "I thought that gravity carried bodies towards the centre of the earth, as if it had some knowledge of the centre within itself, for this surely could not happen without knowledge, and there can be no knowledge except in a mind."
Another way of thinking about how matter takes on its form and is animated is to think in terms of soul. Every living organism has a particular nature, character and behaviour because of the individual soul that informs it. This of course suggests a significant continuity across the living world, because from this perspective it's not just humanity that can speak of having soul.
In the Aristotelian conception of the soul, which is never far beneath the surface of scholastic doctrine, there is an integral connection between soul and body. Soul is to body as form is to matter, and what this means in effect is that it gives it a set of functions. One result of this Aristotelian picture is that there is a kind of continuity between all living things, plants, animals, and man, all things which are alive or ensouled. The soul is the source of the various functions found in plants and animals, and is defined by the faculties of nutrition, perception, thought, and movement.
This meant that the world we inhabited had an intrinsic meaning, purpose, and value to it.
Before the modern period one cannot find, the view that finding values in the natural or human world was uniquely suspicious. It was common throughout the ancient and medieval world to regard things as having natures, and natures as implying or containing purpose and value, most famously Aristotle's final causes that had been taken up by the medieval scholastics.
It was precisely this approach to nature that Descartes turned his back on, particularly in developing his new natural philosophy. So in contrast to this Aristotelian approach, what is Descartes suggesting? Well, firstly, he's rejecting the idea that the natural world is full of mind or soul. It's definitely not that explains its nature and development. For Descartes, and this should sound very familiar to us today, he sees the world as fundamentally made up of physical parts, atoms, or what he calls corpuscles.
Most important to understanding Descartes was the revival of ancient atomism. In opposition to the Aristotelian view of the world, the ancient atomists, Democritus, Epicurus, attempted to explain the characteristic behaviour of bodies not in terms of substantial forms, but in terms of the size, shape, and motion of the smaller bodies, atoms, that make up the grosser bodies of everyday experience, atoms which were taken to move in empty space, a void. So, Descartes' rejection of the forms and matter of the schools and his adoption of the mechanist program for explaining everything in the physical world in terms of size, shape, and motion of the corpuscles that make up bodies is hardly conceivable without the influence of atomist thought.
Somehow, Descartes is going to have to explain all those functions carried out by the Aristotelian soul, using no explanatory resources apart from extended corpuscles and motion. How is he going to manage this? The short answer is that he isn't, but not for lack of trying.
And in his mammoth textbook, The Principles of Philosophy, published in Latin in 1644, he develops just that, a whole system of physics, which explains really the whole cosmos, stars, planets, the earth, plants, trees, rocks, meteors, you name it, everything in terms of particles. And the particles aren't mysterious, they don't have any spooky or occult properties, they just have size, shape, motion. This, I think one can see, is the beginning of modern science. We have the quantifiable world, the world which can be measured, speed calculated, and everything, however complex, whether it's a table, a chair, a horse, a dog, a star, it can be explained for Descartes if only we have accurate enough descriptions of the particles or corpuscles, as he calls them, that makes it up. So the whole universe is a corpuscular universe, if you like, made by God in accordance with mathematical principles.
Even those aspects of our nature that up to that point had been seen as unique to humanity, Descartes was keen to explain in materialistic and atomistic terms.
Inside in his early work on the nature of human beings, Descartes explains a whole range of human activities in terms of the workings of a self-moving machine, which, like a clock or an artificial fountain or mill, has the power to operate purely in accordance with its own internal principles. The complex sequences of movements, which to earlier generations might have appeared to manifest some kind of inner motive, force, or spirit, could all be explained quite simply by reference to internal mechanical structure, cogs, levers, pipes, and the like.
In fact, Descartes' contemporaries were surprised by how far he was willing to go in pushing this form of explanation. For according to Descartes, his new mechanistic, materialistic science could account for many of our human common activities. There was, though, one area of human experience, one essential aspect of who we are, that Descartes believed could not be explained in this new way.
Those of his contemporaries who were accustomed to use the traditional Aristotelian soul terminology later asked Descartes whether he really proposed to dispense with the sensitive soul when explaining, for example, a sheep catching sight of a wolf and running away. Not only did Descartes readily acknowledge that this was indeed his proposal, but he also insisted that, in the case of humans too, a purely mechanistic explanation, making no reference to the soul, was quite sufficient to explain even such waking actions as walking and singing, at least when they occur without the mind attending to them.
So for Descartes, it's not the movement of our bodies that's the issue, the running, the walking, the singing, the fleeing from the approaching wolf. It's the way we're able to attend to those actions, stand back and think about them, to analyse and contemplate them, that is puzzling for Descartes. It is this he finds difficult to explain as just the outcome, inanimate matter in motion.
What Descartes flags up as resistant to mechanistic explanation is the mind's attending to the walking. For example, when I'm not just absent-mindedly walking down the country lane, but I'm deliberately focusing on what I am doing, explicitly thinking or reflecting about it. The last qualification is, of course, crucial. Where mental attention is involved, Descartes is clear that we must posit a separate, rational soul.
It is when we start asking, why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? Is this the right action to take? It's our conscious reasoning about such things that he finds so difficult to explain from the perspective of mechanistic materialism, as Descartes writes.
Since reason is a universal instrument which can be used in all kinds of situations, whereas bodily organs need some particular disposition for each particular action, it is morally impossible for a machine to act in all the contingencies of life in the way in which our reason makes us act.
As John Cottingham explained to me, it's the nature of our consciousness, the reasoning we do as conscious agents, that Descartes and the other rationalists who followed him found so difficult to account for in terms of mindless material.
I think he genuinely thought, when he reflected on the nature of consciousness, that there was nothing about it that savours of physics, of matter, of particles interacting. One of his, a great subsequent philosopher, Leibniz, who's also known as a rationalist, I'll perhaps say a bit more about that later at this time, rather in the spirit of Descartes, imagined an experiment. Supposing the brain was blown up in size, expanded in size, so you could walk inside it, go inside it like a factory. What would you see? Well, you'd see all the parts of the factory, cogs and wheels, mechanisms. We'd nowadays say electrical impulses passed by neurons and neural pathways. But Leibniz said you wouldn't see thought. That's something different. That is some kind of awareness which seems something of a different category from levers pushing and pulling each other, or electrical sparks flashing, or whatever. Now, of course, maybe those physical processes are somehow responsible for thought. But that's something Descartes was doubtful about. In fact, he said it couldn't really be the case. And one thing he points to, which I think is, again, quite interesting even in a modern context where science obviously has moved on, is that the capacity for thought and for language, he links the two very closely together, is pretty much infinite. It's every day you can create and understand new sentences, which you may never have heard before. It's not like a dog barking or a blackbird singing. Stimulus, response, stimulus, response. On the contrary, it's genuinely innovative and creative. And so that again, I think, suggested to Descartes that we're dealing here with something quite different from the physical, mechanistic order of reality. And so he ended up with what's sometimes called dualism, Descartes' dualism, or Cartesian dualism. Cartesian being the adjective meaning pertaining to Descartes from the Latin version of his name, Cartesius. So Cartesian dualism says that there are two radically different kinds of reality. There is extension, whatever can be measured and described in terms of size, shape, motion. So that's the whole physical universe. And then there is consciousness, thought, understanding, willing, those sorts of phenomena, which perhaps we don't understand perfectly even now, but one thing we do know is that we all have them, we all experience them directly. And we know, according to Descartes, that they're quite different from anything measurable in the physical, in physical terms.
As Cottingham explains, even if we do not buy into Descartes' ontological dualism of two distinct entities, we still need to take seriously that aspect of conscious experience that eludes reductive materialism.
When we reflect further on our unique human capacities, even if we go with the flow of modern cognitive science and discard Descartes' immaterial soul, replacing it with the complex physical configuration of the brain, we cannot deny that what is involved when that physical process is activated is a whole world of meaning, of thoughts and reflections and understandings and willings and ponderings that has a life and significance of its own. It cannot be reduced to or read off from the physical events studied by the brain scientist. So even if Descartes was mistaken in supposing it necessary to invoke an immaterial substance to explain this, it nevertheless remains true that the activities he chose to ascribe to the soul are irreducible attributes of our human nature. They belong to us in their own right, as it were, and they define what it is to be human in a way that resists being subsumed under the descriptions and methods of physical science. If this is right, then in the task of understanding our human nature, a task that still confronts us today, we seem to have grounds at least for a kind of attributive dualism, a dualism of two inherently distinct and incommensurable kinds of property or attribute: the physical properties of the body, with its brain and nervous system, and the mental properties of thinking and understanding. We can hold on to this attributive dualism, even if we firmly reject a dualism of two distinct kinds of entity or substance: the body plus an utterly separate and distinct immaterial soul.
The first time I produced a video in the spirit of Descartes questioning whether mindless materialism could really explain our conscious reasoning and understanding, the first response I got was, what about AI? Does that not produce intelligent comprehension and rational understanding from mindless materials? There are several philosophical responses to this line of reasoning, which are explored in videos I have produced for several philosophers and theologians. But a news headline I came across helpfully focused the issue for me, for I recently read this tragic article on a BBC News website.
Parents of teenager who took his own life sue. OpenAI, a California couple, are suing OpenAI over the death of their teenage son, alleging its chatbot, ChatGPT, encouraged him to take his own life.
Now, I don't want to make light of this tragic story, but it did make me wonder about the claims being made for AI. I want to make this point with an imaginary scenario. Imagine you've been taken on as part of the legal team defending the AI company. And the first thing you might do is try and find out as much about AI as you can. And you come across some real enthusiasm. People who are claiming that it's on a par with human intelligence and comprehension. And the more you read this enthusiastic literature and the claims being made from AI, the more you're convinced that there might be a novel line of defence you could pursue. And when you go to meet the company representatives as their lawyer, you explain what you have in mind. You say, look, I've done a lot of research into AI, I've read some dramatic books, visited some enthusiastic websites, listened to some fascinating podcasts, and you say, look, clearly the age of AI is upon us. Humanity no longer has a monopoly on intelligence. I can see that the things we thought were unique to humanity are now able to be reproduced artificially. Before, as a lawyer, I only thought it was people had the capacity for reason and intelligence and understanding. Now you've created something artificial that can do that. How miraculous! And I hope they're impressed by your enthusiasm. If this is the case, you say, then there's an obvious line of defence. For legally, I don't think you need to take the blame for what's happened. AI itself should surely take the blame, or at least some of it. They're not quite getting it, so they ask you to explain further. So you try and think of examples to make the point. You say, look, if you have a dog and the dog does something wrong, you obviously take the blame. Why? Because unlike human beings, it doesn't have our intelligence or rationality. But when your child does something wrong, don't they take some of the blame? Well, because unlike animals, they do have such reasoning and intelligence, and therefore can be held responsible for what they're doing. So there's an obvious way out of your dilemma. If AI is truly intelligent and truly reasonable, as so much as the enthusiastic literature claims it is, when humans are seen to have these faculties, they are held responsible for what they do. So don't you see you're off the hook? When someone does something wrong in our society, we don't put the creator in the dock, we put the creature. So you shouldn't be in the dock, AI should be. Now I imagine this will be seen as a ridiculous suggestion, and of course in many ways it is. But I want to push this point. If artificial intelligence is really to be considered as on a par with human intelligence, why is such a suggestion immediately seen as ridiculous? Might it be that the AI enthusiast doesn't really have the confidence for its own convictions? And this is the central point I want to make. When you start hearing the suggestions why this should be considered as a ridiculous suggestion, are you not just hearing a list of reasons why AI is really not on a par with human intelligence after all? In other words, when you hear the reasons why AI cannot be held responsible for what it does, is it not just that the initial claim about its intelligence being on a par with human intelligence is just being systematically undermined point by point? If that wasn't the case, why would people object to the suggestion? Well, let's start with an obvious example then. When pressed, someone might say, well look, AI in a court of law clearly wouldn't be seen as compos mentis, would it? Of sound mind and understanding and therefore accountable for what it does. And you might say, in what way is that not the case with AI then? And someone might put it in layman terms for you to help you. They say, look, AI doesn't really understand what it's saying or what it's doing, does it? And surely you'd be right in responding by saying, sorry, in what way is it intelligent then? I think it would be fair to give this example. If I told you that I'd met someone who's highly intelligent and eminently rational, but then you found out that this person didn't in fact have the intelligence to comprehend or the reason to actually understand what it was doing or saying, would you not be right to question my claim about their intelligence? Isn't that one of the most basic things about human intelligence, that we understand what we're saying and what we're doing, have that level of comprehension? And of course they might want to qualify this by saying, look, it doesn't understand or comprehend in the way we do. And you might want to ask, well, in what way does it then? And you begin to wonder how many qualifications there's going to be. If you're going to keep qualifying its intelligence in such radical ways, what's then left of the original claim? Now, of course, at this point, someone might ridicule your suggestion and say, are you saying that the judge should threaten AI and say, if you keep misbehaving, we're going to unplug you, we're going to turn you off? And surely that would get a great laugh. But I think you'd be quite right in saying, are you telling me that AI doesn't understand what it is to be turned off or unplugged? I didn't realise its understanding was that limited. Surely your 3 or 4-year-old who's learning how to speak understands pretty quickly what it is to turn something off or to unplug it. Its understanding is astonishingly limited then if it's not really that of a 3-year-old child. And of course you could carry on, but every time they object to your suggestion by giving you reasons why your suggestion would not work, are they not just retracting on the initial claim that artificial intelligence is on a par with human intelligence? That in reality, after all, it doesn't really have the reason to understand or the intelligence to comprehend what it's up to. Now, the point I've been making about lacking the rationality to understand or the intelligence to comprehend what it's doing and saying is made well, I think, by the professor of philosophy, Philip Goff.
My point is simply that an understanding of what things are or mean is part of the character of human experience. I will call this aspect of consciousness experiential understanding. We are so used to our experience being meaningful that we can easily overlook this aspect of consciousness, which is probably why it is little focused on in consciousness science. When we think about understanding in this context, for example, when thinking of artificial intelligence, we are more likely to focus on what we might call functional understanding, a notion of understanding defined in terms of the behavior of a system and its parts. The fact that this notion of understanding is now omnipresent in cognitive science shouldn't blind us to the fact that it is very different to the notion of understanding we standardly employ in ordinary thought, according to which understanding is a matter of what someone consciously grasps. Understanding a mathematical proof, or the punchline of a joke, or the solution to a puzzle, is the aha moment when one sees what the answer is. A non-conscious computer understands nothing in this sense. No matter how sophisticated its functional understanding, It totally lacks experiential understanding. So the response to Descartes, that we now have intelligent understanding and rational comprehension from mindless materialism in the form of AI, is perhaps not as convincing as it first sounds.
As Peter Adamson explains, Descartes would not likely be convinced. Being able to manipulate symbols in rule-governed ways is not the same as showing that you are thinking what you are saying. At the very least, understanding requires a grasp of the semantics of the language. Descartes' meaning requirement, which foreshadows John Searle's Chinese room argument, is the more exacting component of the language test.
The professor of philosophy at Durham University, Philip Goff, is a great example of the overall story I'm wanting to tell. When he began to study philosophy, he was a convinced scientific materialist, even debating religious believers about this point. Primarily through his philosophical studies of human consciousness, he eventually came to give up such mindless materialism and speaks now openly about his religious beliefs. And he explained to me that we need to turn to philosophy to think about these issues. We can't just rely on science.
What I'm always keen to emphasise is that dealing with consciousness is not just a scientific issue, important as the science is. This is also fundamentally a philosophical issue. We have at root the ancient problem philosophers call the mind-body problem, the challenge of explaining how consciousness and the physical world connect. And there are various possibilities. Like maybe the physical world is fundamental and consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain. This is the physicalist view. The view I prefer turns that on its head. Maybe consciousness is fundamental and physical reality somehow emerges from underlying facts about mind or consciousness. Third option, which has probably been the most popular throughout human history, the dualist view, is that they're both fundamental. Consciousness and the physical world are radically different, although intimately intertwined. Now, crucially, all of these views, at least in certain forms, are empirically indistinguishable, which is to say, you can't do an experiment to decide which is correct. For any experimental data, each of these theories will just explain the data in their own terms. So this is why it's not just a scientific question. You can't answer every question with an experiment because sometimes the experiments leave open a range of hypotheses. So what can we do? I mean, maybe you should say, oh, we should just be agnostic. That's in itself interesting, if true, because I think most people assume the physicalist view rather than being agnostic. But I think there are ways we can try to evaluate these different options. We can ask, how well do they explain what they aspire to explain? So the physicalist aspires to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes in the brain. So how well has that gone? I would argue it's gone terribly. And I think there are good philosophical reasons to think it's not even a coherent project. Whereas when it comes to panpsychism, the project of explaining physical reality in terms of consciousness, so doing it the other way around, I think we've made good progress on that. In fact, we actually understand how that could be done. The mysteries have been solved. So we can evaluate these theories in terms of their explanatory aspirations, maybe in terms of how simple and unified they are. Maybe that casts doubt on the dualist view. Why believe in two kinds of thing if you can get everything you want just from talking about one kind of thing? So this is philosophy, right? And I think we live in very scientistic times where people have forgotten that philosophy has a very important role to play in finding out about reality. And if you don't appreciate that, then what you end up is with... And if you don't appreciate that, what you end up with is bad philosophy, because you inevitably get philosophy. It's just not properly scrutinized.
Now we come to the most familiar and famous part of Descartes' philosophy. For this human subjectivity that does the thinking, the reasoning, the reflecting, and sometimes even the doubting, and that for Descartes is inexplicable in terms of his new materialistic science, becomes foundational for the whole of Descartes' philosophy. For he argues that even if we doubt all that we've been taught and inherited from the past, and even come to doubt the testimony of our senses, there is one thing that we cannot doubt, and that's the human thinking subject. In other words, what it is that's doing the doubting. So the reasoning, thinking and contemplating subject of human thought that his new materialistic science could not explain becomes the rock-bottom foundation holding against all forms of scepticism.
As I said, he lived in a time of intellectual ferment when a lot was being doubted. A lot of things that he'd been taught as absolutely rock solid were beginning to be shaken. And he ended up in his philosophy using that doubt, using the method of doubt, not as an end in itself. He wasn't a skeptic. He wasn't one of those philosophers who says, nothing is certain. On the contrary, he's very committed to a project of certainty. But he uses doubt to clear away the rubble. That's one of the metaphors he uses. Clear away the rubble so you can start afresh from something really reliable. And so as an exercise, he begins by doubting even the five senses. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. We think of the senses as our basic route to knowledge, but Descartes was struck by the fact that they can often mislead us. One example, the sun looks roughly the same size as the moon, but actually mathematical reasoning and careful observation shows it's enormously bigger. So he says we shouldn't rely uncritically on what the senses tell us. He then starts to push the doubt even further and doubts even the existence of the external world. Tables, chairs, the floor, the ceiling, even the planet Earth might be a dream, might be some kind of figment of imagination, or might be something beamed into my mind by a malicious demon bent on deceiving me. That's the extremity of the doubt. And then, having reached that extreme of doubt, he reasons that one thing is absolutely certain. He, the doubter, must exist. He must be there in some sense in order to entertain doubts at all, in order to think, in order to meditate. And so in his famous work, The Discourse on the Method, written in French in 1637, he reaches this famous pronouncement, Je pense, donc je suis. I'm thinking, therefore I exist. So even if I doubt I'm thinking, I'm still thinking in order to doubt, so I must exist. And that later is expressed in Latin translations of the discourse as cogito ergo sum, probably the best known pronouncement in philosophy. I'm thinking, therefore I exist.
Descartes may be most famous for his I think, therefore I exist response to scepticism, but he is most infamous for something else, that being his attitude towards the animal kingdom. For if for Descartes so much of our behaviour, apart from our rational reflection, could be explained in purely mechanistic terms, he saw no reason when it came to the non-human world to see it all as nothing but complex machinery.
Descartes is the most radical champion of the doctrine of animal automatism. The doctrine of animal automatism, that animals are just complex, self-moving machines, no different in nature from clocks or other automata. Descartes advanced the doctrine at an early stage of his philosophical development, beginning around 1619, and at various times experimented with creating automata using magnets, a flying bird, a pheasant chased by a spaniel, and even a humanoid automaton whom he allegedly named Francine. His last letters to Henry More in 1649 show him still engaged in defending the doctrine. That his infamy was to a significant extent tied to his defense of the doctrine of animal automatism is clear from one salient fact. that every set of objections to the Meditations contains some rant or other against the doctrine. What was it about the idea of the meat machine that was so provocative? Descartes envisages being able to construct a machine that senses in the way animals do. If you were to touch the machine in one spot, he says, it would ask what you want, and if in another, cry out that you are hurting it. But none of this would convince us that the machine really feels pain or is communicating its wants. If we could construct such a machine with neither genuine feeling nor consciousness, why suppose that the responses of animals are indicative of genuine feeling or awareness? If an artificial automaton were engineered to act in ways wholly indiscernible from that of an animal, say a monkey, we would, he writes, have no grounds for concluding that they were not of the same nature. To his mind, the best science would tell us that animal cognition and sensibility are only apparent, anthropomorphic projections of the kinds of explanations we use to understand each other.
Descartes is often held up as the ultimate example of philosophical dismissiveness toward animals, and not without good reason. He told a contemporary philosopher, Mauson, that when animals are harmed, they have no awareness of pain. No wonder he had no compunctions about engaging in vivisection, meaning the anatomical dissection of living animals, as part of his scientific investigations. We're liable to be appalled by all this, and to think it was really Descartes who was insensitive and unfeeling, not the animals.
It's not that he wasn't impressed by animals. He saw animals as wonders of God's creation, but wonders that for scientific reasons he was willing to torture.
There are some fairly ghastly implications in the Cartesian view. Recall that it denied reason to animals, and as a result, denied all the other attributes of mental life to them as well, including the capacity for conscious experiences such as pain, and claimed that animals are just carnal machines, which only seem to have feelings. No one in antiquity or the Middle Ages could have embraced so foul a notion. In the ancient view, all that lives is soul, and all that is soul is aware. I won't discuss the atrocities to which the Cartesian doctrine sometimes led.
The philosopher Lawrence Cahoon illustrates these worrying implications in rather graphic terms.
Notice a very important thing, a very important and perhaps perplexing consequence of Descartes' view. Descartes is a dualist, a metaphysical dualist. There's only two boxes in which to put any reality. It's matter in motion, extended substance, a physical object like a rock, or it's a mind, a human mind and a soul. This means non-human living things have no soul or mind. They are purely physical, exactly like a machine. So for example, for Descartes, if I take my pet rabbit and put it in a blender and turn on the blender, which I probably won't do, but if I were to do that, for Descartes, the scream that the rabbit emits is not an indication that it feels pain. The rabbit feels no pain. It feels no more pain than my fan belt does, which also screams if it needs replacing or if it's very loose. Now, how in the world could he say such a thing, that animals have no feelings, can't feel pain, etc.? How could he say that? He absolutely must say it. It's implicit in his entire scheme. Why? Because there are only two options. If the rabbit were to have feelings, it would have to have a mental substance or mind. Only mental substances can have feelings. He can't do that, so he's stuck. Animals are nothing but machines.
But what happens when the first Cartesian category is deleted or denied, that of mind, which was soon to happen? Then there are not two boxes in which to put reality, but only one. That means that not only the animal kingdom, but humanity as well, must be put in the second box. That, in Cahoon's words, is just matter in motion, extended substance, physical objects like a rock.
For a truly scientific view of reality, it came to be believed everything, even mind, must be reducible to one and the same mechanics of motion. Those methodological brackets that had been so helpfully drawn around the physical order became the very shape of reality itself.
Ironically, It was Descartes himself who forced his interlocutors to accept the role of science in settling questions about which things have souls, which things think, and which act in deliberate, intentional ways. A move he could not have anticipated would open the door to the kind of naturalistic psychology and the undoing of his own dualistic conception of the human being.
Once that has happened, we will inevitably have to ask, does the next part of Cahoon's logic also follow? That he so graphically illustrated in terms of his pet rabbit? Well, if there's only one box left to put things in, and that is physical materialism, then his chilling logic is difficult to avoid. So to put it rather bluntly, would we have to replace the word rabbit with the word person and say,
The scream that the person emits is not an indication that it feels pain. The person feels no pain. It feels no more pain than my fan belt does, which also screams if it needs replacing or if it's very loose. Now, how in the world could he say such a thing that persons have no feelings, can't feel pain, etc.? How could he say that? He absolutely must say it. It's implicit in his entire scheme. Why? Because there are only two options. If the person were to have feelings, it would have to have a mental substance or mind. Only mental substances can have feelings.
once you get rid of mind, what other option is there than to follow Cahoon's frightening logic? But you might ask, surely there aren't many people that actually believe that there's only one category, one box, in which all reality must fit. But as Cahoon explains further,
The dominant metaphysical view today is physicalism, the view that what has the greatest claim on constituting reality is the objects of fundamental physics in their causal interactions. Everything is physical, has mass and spatial location. What is real, or most real, or the basis of everything real, is actual physical particulars, like me and the computer I am working on. If objective reality independent of the judgments of individual human subjects is constituted solely by physical particulars, then lots of things would be unreal. Meanings and ideas, not to mention minds. All these are either unreal or real but enormous complexes of little actual physical bits.
when the materialistic pronouncements of the world-famous scientist Francis Crick are read in this context, they not only sound bleak, they can actually sound sinister, even threatening.
You're nothing but a pack of neurons. You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules.
If Descartes' contemporaries were scandalised by the fact that Descartes saw the animal kingdom as nothing more than complex machinery to be manipulated, and its screams could be ignored as just the sounds of faulty machinery, should it not be even more worrying, perhaps horrifying, when we are told everything must be seen in these terms, including humanity? Because philosophers at the time were only too aware of the possible implications of this conclusion, there was a good deal of philosophical resistance to the idea that everything could be explained in terms of mindless materialism.
As Cahoon explains, the central task of philosophy in the 17th century was to figure out how to reconcile the new mechanical physics with our understanding of human mind, will, soul, and values.
He sees this philosophy of reconciliation not only in the work of Descartes, but also Spinoza and Leibniz, and as a task that is just as relevant for today. The next video in the series will hopefully look at a further consequence of this scientific revolution for philosophy in the road from philosophy to faith.